Ever stared at a U.S. population density map and noticed how empty the southeast coast looks? It's kind of odd. Places like Georgia and the Carolinas have their biggest cities way inland, sometimes hundreds of miles from the coast. Meanwhile, the coast itself seems kind of barren. What's up with that? Why is there this big blank stretch between the buzzing northeast and the packed beaches of Florida? The answer goes way beyond chance. It's a story about old rocks, disease, tricky navigation, and game-changing inventions. I'm Emma Chamberlain, and this is Smart Scope. Today, we're diving into one of the weirdest demographic mysteries in America. We're looking at why the coastlines of Georgia, South Carolina, and North Carolina are so empty compared to the jam-packed cities deep inside these states. Atlanta, Charlotte, Raleigh, and a bunch of other booming cities, all miles from the water. The reasons stretch back millions of years and involve everything from swampy land and malaria to steamboats and train tracks. Let's just start with the map. If you glance at a population map of the U.S., it's easy to see that most people live near the coasts. But down in the southeast, the pattern flips. The coastal parts of Georgia, South Carolina, and North Carolina look almost deserted compared to what's inland. Atlanta, Augusta, Columbia, Greenville, Charlotte, Greensboro, Raleigh, Durham, all heavyweights, and not one of them sits on the ocean. On the coast itself, you've just got a handful of bigger towns, Savannah, Charleston, and Wilmington. But really, in the grand scheme of American cities, they're small. Charleston doesn't even clear 900,000 in its metro area, and both Wilmington and Savannah are well below 500,000. For states their size, it's surprising how little action there is on the water. Savannah is only the third biggest city in Georgia. Charleston is second in South Carolina, still behind Columbia, which is inland. Wilmington? In North Carolina, it's sixth, while the top five are all further away from the sea. Now, take a look north or south of this weird stretch. Heading up through Virginia and into New England, you hit city after city hugging the shore. The Northeast Corridor, with over 50 million people packed in, all the way from D.C. to Boston. Swing down past Georgia to Florida, and suddenly the coast is busy again. Jacksonville, Miami, Tampa, St. Pete, and more. These places make the coastal towns in Georgia and the Carolinas look tiny. So why do the Carolinas and Georgia have this giant gap, a dead zone for people, right along the coast? The story isn't simple, but it's definitely fascinating. To make sense of it, you have to go back. Way back. The eastern U.S. sits on layers upon layers of ancient geology. One of the most important features is the Appalachian Mountains. They run from Alabama through Georgia and up to Maine, a spine right through the east. These mountains are old, about 300 million years old. Back in the day, they were probably as tall as the Himalayas. But time and erosion wore them down, leaving behind much smaller peaks. As rivers carved down the mountains, they dragged sand, silt, and mud with them. This created two main landscapes between the Appalachians and the ocean. First, you have the Piedmont, rolling hills built on hard bedrock, decent for travel and building. After that comes the Atlantic coastal plain. That's the flat, often swampy, sandy land that stretches right up to the shoreline, a place shaped by millions of years of rivers dumping silt from the mountains. And, as you'll see, these features did more than shape the scenery. They shaped where people could actually live. Take a close look at a map of the East Coast, and you'll see the Atlantic coastal plain really spreads out across Georgia and the Carolinas. Down there, it stretches hundreds of kilometers, creating a broad, flat buffer between the higher Piedmont and Appalachian regions and the actual shoreline. But move north into Virginia, and things start to change. The coastal plain gets slimmer, squeezing tighter and tighter until you get up to New York City and Long Island, where it just kind of disappears. In fact, in the Bronx, you can actually see the rocky foothills of the Catskills poking right into the city, while way down in Georgia, the plain is still wide open. You feel this shift in the landscape as soon as you drive north or south out of New York City. Head north, and the difference is obvious. The rocky backbone of the region hits the ocean, starting in Connecticut and running all the way to Maine. The coast here is rough and jagged, with barely any sandy stretches or barrier islands. But if you go south from New York, including Long Island down to Florida, it's all broad, sandy beaches, marshes, swamps, and those long, thin barrier islands shielding the shore. Coastal cities are a bit easier to build north of New York City than south of it. Now, look at the stretch from New York City all the way down through Alabama. There's a dividing line that separates the lower, flatter coastal plain from the higher Piedmont to the west. The land doesn't jump up or down suddenly, it gradually shifts in elevation. But rivers flowing from the Appalachians down to the Atlantic really notice the difference. When they cross this line, they drop from the hard, elevated rocks of the Piedmont, tumble through rapids and waterfalls, and finally spill onto the flat, sandy plain for a smooth run to the sea. Those rapids and falls gave the boundary a pretty straightforward name, the fall line. It's probably the most important geographic dividing line in the eastern United States, even though hardly anyone talks about it outside the region. Back in the 1600s, when European settlers were arriving in big numbers, rivers were their highways into the continent. Along the East Coast, the fall line was as far as their ships could go inland from the ocean. Rapids and waterfalls blocked further travel. So settlers had to stop there, unload everything, and drag cargo and people further inland on smaller boats or wagons. Ships coming downriver from the interior hit the same problem. They couldn't get past the falls, so they had to stop and offload as well. Naturally, all this loading and unloading turned spots along the fall line into the best places for warehouses, markets, and banks. Towns sprung up right at these bottlenecks, and over time they became inland trading hubs. Sitting at the edge of both regions, these towns funneled goods between the resource-rich Piedmont and the busy seaports on the coast. It didn't stop there. Cities on the fall line also used the fast-moving rivers to power mills and early factories. That gave them a head start in manufacturing, with easy access both to raw materials upstream and to ocean ports downstream for shipping finished products around the world. Here's how it played out. The Savannah River let ships travel about 320 kilometers inland before the rapids blocked them, right where Augusta grew up. The Congaree allowed about 170 kilometers of smooth travel before meeting the fall line and the future site of Columbia. The Potomac stretched about 195 kilometers from the Chesapeake before its own falls, and right before you hit them is where Washington, D.C. was founded. Take a look at a map from Alabama up to New York City, and along the fall line, you'll notice a string of modern cities: Montgomery, Alabama, Columbus, Macon, and Augusta in Georgia, Columbia, South Carolina, Fayetteville, Raleigh, and Durham in North Carolina, Richmond and Fredericksburg in Virginia, Washington, D.C., Baltimore, Wilmington, Delaware, Philadelphia, New Brunswick and Trenton in New Jersey, and then, of course, New York City at the end of the line. The fall line's influence is so strong that you can actually see it from space. Check satellite images and you'll spot that farms west of the fall line, out in the Piedmont, are much greener than those to the east, on the Atlantic coastal plain. Long ago, before time and erosion wore down the Appalachians, the fall line marked the edge of the old coastline. The land that's now the Atlantic coastal plain was covered mostly by shallow coastal waters, eventually filled over millions of years with sand and sediment. Today, soils on the Atlantic coastal plain are usually sandy, acidic, and not that nutrient-rich. They can still grow things, but they're not nearly as productive as the soils up in the Piedmont. The plain is also packed with swamps and wetlands, the highest concentration you'll find anywhere in North America. That's not great news for farming. Drainage is poor, and trying to build towns or roads out there, it's tough. Take a look at a geographic map, and you'll see that in Georgia and the Carolinas, these wetlands push much farther inland than they do up north, starting in Virginia. This lines up almost perfectly with the width of the Atlantic coastal plain and the reach of the fall line. So, founding cities right on or near the coast actually got easier as you headed north from Virginia. Swamps and wetlands get narrower as you move up the coast, and by the time you hit New York City, the fall line practically touches the ocean. The Northeast, and even Florida farther south, also has much better natural harbors than the low country around the Carolinas and Georgia. Up in New England, the coast turns rocky and ragged, which is perfect for harbors. Places like Portland, Maine, Boston, and Rhode Island's Narragansett Bay all have classic harbor geography. Then you hit New York Harbor, sitting at the mouths of the Hudson and East Rivers, one of the world's best natural harbors. It connects way inland through the Hudson River, all the way to Albany, and after they built the Erie Canal in 1825, you could get all the way to the Great Lakes. Philadelphia is hooked up to another great natural harbor thanks to the Delaware Bay and River. South of that, the Chesapeake Bay is just massive, one of the planet's largest protected waterways. The southern end holds Hampton Roads, Virginia Beach Harbor, and, just like New York Harbor, it's a world-class spot. Deepest natural harbor on the East Coast, dead center geographically, right at the mouth of the Chesapeake. It's always been perfect for a big Navy presence. That's why the U.S. Navy set up its largest base there, and it became the top spot for building and repairing ships, including every one of America's nuclear aircraft carriers. But what really makes the Hampton Roads Virginia Beach Harbor stand out is its surroundings. Just south, the coasts of the Carolinas and Georgia become a nightmare for building ports. Starting right below Hampton Roads, you hit the Outer Banks of North Carolina, a long, shifting string of barrier islands, notorious for being the most dangerous coastline for ships. In fact, over the past 500 years, more than 5,000 ships sank around the Outer Banks. They didn't call it the graveyard of the Atlantic for nothing. Cape Hatteras, right in the heart of the Outer Banks, is where the coastline suddenly swings north. Up until that point, the coast runs pretty much northeast from Georgia, but here it breaks that pattern. Off Cape Hatteras, you get a wild mashup. Warm Gulf Stream water pushes up from Florida and crashes into the cold Labrador Current diving down from Canada. All that mixing churns up a ton of turbulence, stirring sediment everywhere. At the same time, the continental shelf here slopes gently, so sand keeps shuttling back and forth between deep and shallow waters. One minute, it's pushing up from the depths, the next, getting dragged back down. That's what builds an unpredictable maze of shifting sandbars and shoals, turning navigation into a nightmare. Even in the age of GPS and high-tech ships, vessels still run aground here, like that 100-foot fishing trawler that sank in 2024 while trying to squeeze through Oregon Inlet, which itself ripped through the barrier island during a hurricane way back in 1846. It's not just ships at risk. The very shape of these islands changes all the time. Sometimes, new land just suddenly shows up. Take Shelley Island, for example. Popped up in April 2017 near Cape Hatteras, stretched a mile long and 500 feet wide, and then, boom, vanished beneath the waves less than a year later. To keep things stable, ports are stuck constantly dredging. That struggle's been going on for centuries, and is the main reason big, deep-water inlets never form here naturally. Because of that, North Carolina's Outer Banks have no major ports, and really, no big coastal cities. If you're looking for a halfway reliable natural harbor in North Carolina, Wilmington is about all you've got. It sits at the mouth of the Cape Fear River, down in the far south. That's why it became North Carolina's first prominent coastal town south of Virginia Beach. But even Wilmington's inlet isn't all that deep, and Cape Fear River isn't exactly grand. It's shallow, doesn't stretch that far, and even today, with modern locks and dams, only small boats can go all the way up to Fayetteville. it just couldn't compete with the bigger ports up north. There are two standout harbors between Wilmington and Florida: Charleston in South Carolina and Savannah in Georgia. These are world-class, deep, totally sheltered, and have been vital trading ports for ages. Savannah ranks as the second busiest container port on the East Coast, right behind New York, and Charleston is fourth behind Virginia Beach. Charleston also scores as the second deepest harbor on the coast after Virginia Beach. Way back, Savannah, Charleston, and Wilmington were the largest cities in their states. Their rivers connect the fall line, the point where the Piedmont meets the coastal plain, and made it pretty easy for farmers, miners, and manufacturers to move goods downriver to the ports and out to global markets. But even with their great harbors, none of these towns grew into megacities like the ones up north or down in Florida. Why? Well, hurricanes, for starters. If you look at maps of hurricane risk across the continental U.S., the Gulf Coast and southern edges of Georgia and the Carolinas are smack in the danger zone. Things shift once you hit Virginia. The risk drops, and the coast all the way up to Maine sees far fewer hurricanes. Cooler waters up north weaken storms, and the winds usually steer hurricanes away from the coast, deeper into the Atlantic. Plus, the bend in the coastline at Cape Hatteras helps. Once a hurricane passes through there, it tends to veer away from land instead of barreling further inland. Since 1851, the Carolinas have seen 90 hurricanes make landfall, while Georgia's count sits at 22. Move north a bit, and Virginia has only had 13, New York just 15. Notably, Virginia has never been hit by a major Category 3 to 5 hurricane. North Carolina's seen 7, South Carolina 5, and Georgia 3. Florida still gets it the worst, but the Carolinas and Georgia sit right in between. Not as battered as Florida, but far more vulnerable than Virginia or anywhere further north. All this hurricane exposure makes it tough for these states to develop their coasts. But that's not the only issue. Their coastlines are wrapped in swamps and marshes, especially around spots like Savannah, Charleston, and Wilmington. These harbors might be naturally valuable, but the surrounding wetlands are basically roadblocks to sprawling cities. Building out is tough, and mosquitoes absolutely thrive in these conditions, creating another reason why these coastal areas have always had fewer people than their interiors. Malaria, humanity's deadliest disease, wasn't even native to the Americas. It arrived in the 1600s when European settlers and enslaved Africans landed in the region. Mosquitoes in the southeastern coastal plain took to it fast. The climate matched malaria's original home in tropical Africa. Hot, humid summers, loads of rainfall, and endless marshes. When rice and indigo plantations popped up in the Carolinas and Georgia, they pumped more water through tidal marshes, giving mosquitoes, and malaria, endless places to multiply. The plantation system forced huge numbers of enslaved Africans to work in this environment, keeping close contact with mosquitoes and fueling non-stop malaria transmission. By the 1700s, malaria had become a brutal part of life along the Atlantic coastal plain through Georgia, the Carolinas, and parts of Virginia. People started calling it the malaria zone. Summers were deadly, with infection rates and mortality spiking. Meanwhile, the Piedmont region, higher and drier, didn't have the same swamps and stagnant water. Fewer mosquitoes, less malaria. Wealthy white elites would flee to the Piedmont during summers, leaving enslaved laborers behind in the fields. This seasonal migration left coastal ports like Charleston and Savannah empty in summer, while Piedmont towns filled up. That's why, in time, all three states planted their capitals deep in the interior: Atlanta for Georgia, Columbia for South Carolina, and Raleigh for North Carolina. This decision helped anchor permanent populations and gave the interior more political clout. The Northeast coast just didn't face these same challenges. Their cities sit right by the fall line, so there's less incentive to build further inland. Hurricanes are much rarer up north, and their coasts aren't hemmed in by malaria-ridden marshes either. Up there, the climate gets colder and harsher the farther inland you go. In the southeast, it's the opposite. the climate gets friendlier as you move away from the coast. One of the strange twists in this whole story is that malaria never really hit Florida as hard as it did coastal Georgia or the Carolinas. That goes against what you might expect, considering Florida is so famously swampy. The main reason is actually pretty simple. Florida just didn't have that many Europeans living there up until the mid to late 1800s. With fewer people around, malaria had a harder time settling in and sticking around. In Georgia and the Carolinas, though, the disease found a foothold thanks to slavery and constant human traffic, which kept spreading it. Now, Florida's swamps sound like perfect mosquito territory. But here's the thing. Most of those coastal marshes are saltwater. The kind of mosquito that usually carries malaria isn't into salt water. It likes fresh or slightly brackish standing water, which you find a lot more of in Georgia and the Carolinas. The varieties of mosquitoes buzzing around South Florida just weren't as good at carrying malaria as those in the other two states. Plus, most early coastal towns in Florida, St. Augustine, Key West, later Miami, popped up on barrier islands or windy shores. Those spots don't give mosquitoes much of a chance. Compare that to Charleston and Savannah, where cities sat right in the middle of Mosquito Central, among tidal estuaries and rice fields. That made malaria a constant threat in Georgia and the Carolinas, but not in Florida. So, malaria didn't end up shaping Florida's population patterns the way it did farther north. Malaria stuck around coastal Georgia and the Carolinas for generations. Even after slavery ended and plantations collapsed in 1865, the remnants of rice fields kept breeding mosquitoes for years, though the problem began easing up once people stopped tending the fields. Quinine showed up in the late 1800s as a way to treat malaria, not prevent it outright, and the push for urbanization helped drain puddles and marshes. Still, even in the 1930s, malaria was all over rural Georgia and the Carolinas. Things got so bad that when they created what would become the CDC, they set up shop in Atlanta in 1946, with the main goal of wiping out malaria in the Southeast. That finally happened in the late 1940s and early 1950s, after a mix of massive DDT spraying, draining swamps, and putting up window screens. Only since the early 1950s has malaria stopped being this constant threat hanging over settlements in the region. There's another reason the biggest cities in Georgia, Florida, and the Carolinas tend to be inland now, not on the coast. And it has everything to do with the railroads. Atlanta is the perfect example. Before the 1830s, Atlanta didn't even exist. The main towns were Savannah and a few others lined up across the state's fall line, like Augusta. But Georgia didn't want all its trade tied to Savannah's seasonal port. They started working on a railroad between Savannah and Chattanooga, which would link Georgia straight into the Tennessee River and, by extension, the whole Midwest. In 1837, they picked a spot in northern Georgia, south of the mountains, as the railroad's endpoint. There was nothing there, just a level patch of land. That spot would become Atlanta. Oddly enough, Atlanta wasn't founded because of natural advantages, like rivers or harbors. It grew because the railroad needed a junction point. People called it Terminus at first, but by 1847, the town got the name Atlanta, supposedly inspired by the Western and Atlantic Railroad, and tweaked to sound a little fancier. Atlanta stayed small until after the Civil War. When Georgia moved its capital there in 1868, the city started to boom, with rapid growth and industry. By 1880, Atlanta overtook Savannah as the state's main city, and it's been on top ever since. You see similar patterns in the Carolinas, too. Charleston was the biggest city in South Carolina for most of the state's history, but eventually Columbia, sitting right along the fall line, caught up and passed it in the 1940s. These days, Columbia's metro area is still bigger than Charleston's. In North Carolina, Wilmington used to be the largest city on the coast, but by the time the 1910 census rolled around, Charlotte had taken the lead. Charlotte shared a lot of the same advantages that boosted Atlanta's growth. Atlanta itself grew fast because it became a crossroads for several railroads, connecting it to Savannah on the coast, Montgomery on the Gulf, and even Chattanooga, plugging Atlanta right into the big Mississippi River system. It turned into the main railroad hub for the Southeast, pretty much the Chicago of the South, which locked in its role as a key logistics center early on. When the interstate highways came through in the 1950s and 60s, Atlanta's importance just grew. Interstates 20, 75, and 85 all thread through the heart of the city, establishing it as a major highway crossroads on top of its role in rail transport. Building on all of this, Atlanta naturally became a huge air travel hub in the 20th century. The city sits more or less in the center of the Southeast. Within a couple hours' flight, you can hit Miami, New York, Chicago, Dallas, Kansas City. Most of the country east of the Mississippi is just a short flight away. This made Atlanta the perfect connecting point for flights between Florida, the Gulf Coast, the Midwest, and the Northeast. Even for long-haul trips across the country, stopping in Atlanta just makes sense. It's central without dragging you too far off your route. Atlanta's weather helps too. There's a slim stretch across the interior of the eastern U.S. Think central Texas, up through Arkansas, Tennessee, Alabama, Georgia, and into western North Carolina. It's far enough from the coast that hurricanes don't cause much trouble, but not so far north that big snowstorms shut everything down. Airports like Atlanta, Dallas-Fort Worth, and Charlotte all sit in this Goldilocks zone, and all rank among the busiest in the country. That combination of location, weather, and connections is exactly why Delta Airlines made Atlanta its headquarters back in 1941, turning the city into their global hub. By 1957, Atlanta already led the country for passenger traffic, and it's kept that title ever since. Actually, it's not just America's busiest airport anymore, but the world's. With this inland logistics superhub firmly in place, tons of other businesses set up shop here too. UPS, Home Depot, Coca-Cola, you name it. Even the CDC keeps its headquarters here, cementing Atlanta's reputation as a magnet for jobs and people. So why do so few people live along the southeast coast? And why are most big cities inland? It comes down to ancient geology, geography, and a long string of history and circumstance. The fall line and the milder Piedmont climate steered early settlements inland. Swampy marshes along the coast were mosquito-filled malaria traps for centuries, keeping big towns from developing there until pretty recently. On top of that, hurricanes and the tricky waters around places like North Carolina's Outer Banks made coastal life a risky bet. That's why Georgia and the Carolinas moved their capitals inland early on. Then, when railroads, highways, and air travel came along, inland cities won out again, connecting easily to markets without having to rely entirely on port cities like Savannah, Charleston, or Wilmington. It's a combination of nature, history, and pure practicality that shaped where people put down roots in the Southeast. That's pretty much why there's no big city, nothing over 1 million people, anywhere along the southeast coast between Virginia Beach and Jacksonville. This stretch, wedged between the booming Northeast and packed parts of Florida, just doesn't have a dense cluster of people. And it still stands out, even today. If you got something out of this video, if it helped you make sense of American geography, or just put words to something you'd wondered about, go ahead and like the video, subscribe to SmartScope, and pass it along to anyone else who's curious. Digging into why people live where they do actually opens up bigger stories. You start to see how history, disease, technology, and even geology all leave their mark. The empty stretch along the southeast coast isn't just random. It's the end result of ancient geological change, years of risk and disease, and more recent human efforts. Thanks for sticking with me. Catch you in the next video.